Well, I was involved in a study of why there was been so much social unrest in US cities in the 1960s. I mean, this was a period of very strong urbanization in the United States, but certain populations were left behind, and you had marginalized black populations in inner cities. And throughout the 1960s, there were revolutionary uprisings in Watts in Los Angeles and in Detroit and so on. And after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, pretty much every city in the United States, it was just an explosion. And chunks of cities were burned down, and there was kind of... So this was seen as an urban crisis. I didn't call it an urban revolution there at the time, but some people did, saying this is a revolutionary movement which is centered upon the cities. And I was largely caught up in a sort of answering the question of why is it that in the richest country of the world, housing provision for low-income African Americans in central cities is so bad. Why, what's the problem? And of course there's conventional social science which I could look at, and I started to find this was not very satisfactory, because the laws of supply and demand, just sort of mechanical kind of explanations. So I started to unpack it a little bit, and then I started to look at what happened in the housing market in Baltimore. And I was part of a fairly big study looking at all aspects of it. And we did a lot of sort of investigative work. And I started to think about how to theorize this and think about it. And at that time, I just happened to be reading some Marx, and I thought this notion of distinction between a use value system and exchange value system, and what Marx calls the antinomy between use and exchange value, lay at the heart of the thing, and that the problem was that the use value, delivery of adequate housing use values to this population was essentially disrupted by the insistence that there be an exchange value configuration, and that there was something basically wrong with the organization of the exchange value system, which was lay at the root of the problem. So I started to work on that kind of line. And I was surprised when we did the report to bankers and financiers and estate agents and everybody who was interested in the urban question. Many people thought this was a very sensible way to look at the whole kind of problem. And since it came from page 1 of Marx's Capital, I thought it was a good job I didn't tell them this is where it came from, But the thing was that there was something commonsensical about this formulation, and something that was helpful about it that kind of got you out of the mechanical kind of way of thinking about supply and demand, and got you into thinking about the antinomy and the contradiction which existed between these two requirements of maximizing use values and maximizing exchange values, and you can't maximize both. And if you maximize use values, you're not going to do it with the exchange values. And if you maximize exchange values, you don't deliver good housing to anybody. So this was kind of the simple kind of version. And from that time onwards, I was constantly sort of looking in Marx for inspiration to understand certain aspects of the dynamics. And the more I went on, the more I found, and the more helpful I found it became. And I think this has been one of the qualities of my so-called Marxism, since that it's always been oriented to practical purposes. And that if there are certain aspects of Marx's thinking which are kind of, sort of way off base, I would kind of go, okay, it's way off base, I'm not going to follow that one because it doesn't work. And then there are certain aspects that he didn't follow up and should have followed up. So I've had a more flexible kind of approach to Marx for that reason. And when I started to write about Marx, of course, given my interest in urbanization, I couldn't write about urbanization without writing about finance. And when I first started to write about Marx, very few people were writing about finance. You couldn't do it without looking at land and land rent and property rent and prices and what happened in land markets, and hardly anybody was writing about that, so I was writing about that. And of course, nobody much, apart from, you know, Lefebvre and a few others, were writing about the production of space as being as being a crucial part of the dynamics of a capitalist economy. So I was importing into Marx a lot of things that were not in the Marxist tradition, at the same time as I was sort of trying to advance Marx's thinking so that it could work better in relationship to these particular phenomena I was studying. Well, it grows bigger and bigger each time, which is one of the reasons why I take the anti-capitalist position, which is to say we've got to get off this cycle. I mean, if you look at what Haussmann did to Paris as being in part an answer to the economic crisis of 1848, you kind of go, okay, we remade Paris, and there doesn't seem to be a big, huge problem about that. When Moses redid the whole New York metropolitan region after 1945, again absorbing surpluses of capital and labor in a suburbanization project. Well, you know, this has a lot of environmental consequences. For example, you think about global warming and the arrival of the automobile, and you think of land use and habitat destruction and so on through this. So this is beginning to be problematic, it seems to me, on a much bigger scale. You now look what's happening in China, and you're looking at a scale of this which is unbelievable. But it's connected, of course, to the fact that at least a third of the world's growth since 2007, 2008 has been coming out of China. And its demand for copper and soybeans and everything else has propped up Latin American economies, for example. So when China starts to slow down, which it did in 2014, and has begun to slow down again a bit now, these other countries that are supplying all of this, like Brazil and Chile and Australia, start to have financial and economic difficulties. But this urbanization project is basically one of the big things that saved global capitalism from a huge crisis. But the dimensions of it are so enormous compared to what Haussmann did in Paris that you kind of go, well, this can't, you know, you can't imagine another crisis like this in 50 years' time. I mean, multiplied in the way. And the example I use is that in 2 years, China consumed 45% more cement than the United States consumed in 100 years. And of course, if you live in the United States, you know the United States has consumed a lot of cement, even in my lifetime. But to find that this is what China has done, and China's consumed half of the world's cement supplies, half of the world's copper, half of the world's iron ore. I mean, this is a huge thing. Now, I don't say this to be anti-Chinese. I mean, people sometimes kind of say, yeah, well, it's those Chinese, you know, it's all their fault. No, the Chinese saved global capitalism. They had to save themselves because they had a lot of surplus of capital and labor, and they did it through this massive urbanization and infrastructure or investment project. And, you know, it's problematic to think that, well, you know, global indebtedness stands now at something like over 200% of global GDP, which is a huge, huge indebtedness number. And if that indebtedness increases by, you know, a factor of, you know, if it doubles over the next, 15 years, and it has been doubling about every 15 years since 1970s, then we're going to work in a world which is just swimming in debt. And Marx had an interesting kind of comment about this. He sort of said, well, when he was thinking about the role of finance, he said, you know, there comes a point where it may be that the accumulation of wealth in the world is going to be measured by the accumulation of debt. And we've pretty much got to that point now. Well, the big problem is that value in Marx is a social relation. And all social relations are immaterial but objective. And he says this right at the beginning of Volume 1 of Capital. The value is therefore immaterial but objective. Now, people have a difficulty with this because, you know, Marx is generally regarded as a materialist thinker. And to say that his foundational concept is immaterial but objective kind of rubs people a bit wrong. But his point is that the key thing here is the social relation. And the social relation can't be measured. I mean, there's a social relation between you and I. How do you measure it? I don't know. As a teacher, if you were my student, there would be a measure of it at a certain point because I would put a score beside your name. This is what Marx means by immaterial but objective. There's a relation between you and I in the course in which presumably you're learning things, and sometimes people are learning a lot and sometimes people aren't learning much at all. But at the end of it, I'm going to have an objective figure which says you scored A or B or C or whatever. And this is always a very, very difficult thing to score. I always feel as a teacher that I'm very interested in how far you have come in a course from where you started. So at the end of a course, if you show me that you have a very sophisticated command of, you know, the course, but you started the course with a very sophisticated command, I don't think you've learned that much in the class. Whereas you find somebody who starts from nowhere, in fact, has a mind full of ideological baggage, which is anti-Marx, and all I've managed to do in a semester is to clear some of that baggage out so they can get, but they really have no idea about the general theory. Then what do? Do I say that because you have a sophisticated knowledge, you deserve an A, and they deserve a C because they haven't got any sophisticated knowledge, even though intellectually they have advanced enormously? How do I grade that? This is something I experience as a teacher, but it's about the social relation, and it's about what's going on in people's minds, what's going on in my mind, what's going on in your mind, how those minds can meet somehow or other. So when we talk about social relations, they're always immaterial. But, as Marx kind of says, they're objective. And so if I give you an A and I give the other person a C, then you may be able to get a job, okay, and they will not. That's wrong. You see, that to me is wrong, particularly if they have worked extremely hard at getting them to sell. So this is the dilemma. And capital is like that with a lot of what it does. So the value theory is there, but then it needs a measure. And its measure is the money form. And Marx talks about the contradiction between money as a representation of value and value itself. And we shouldn't confuse money with value. And there's always the possibility that the money will lie, or the money will get something right and something wrong, in the same way that my grading you, at the end, you see, I can't give two grade sheets, one which has you as an A and the other person as an A, but I just say, this person I can't do that, so I have to end up on a single grade sheet. Well, that's the same true with money. It's like that, yet there are many kind of complexities in the value relation which get absolutely obscured by the money form, and Marx is aware of this. And he says also money has certain properties which value does not have. For instance, given money as a social relation, I have no means of accumulating value. I can't accumulate value. It's a social relation. I mean, as soon as the social relation disappears, the value disappears. On the other hand, I can accumulate money. So I can accumulate the representative of the social relation, but I can't accumulate the social relation. And so there are these dilemmas, which I think are foundational for how we understand what's going on in society. And my problem with a lot of conventional economics, including Marxist economics, is that relation, the whole relation between value and its representation. Because you can't measure value, the tendency amongst positivist thinkers is to say it doesn't exist. If you can't measure it, it does not exist. And that then puts me in a situation like I want to talk in our contemporary times about alienation. Alienation, I think, is to me a very important concept right now. We've got alienated populations. And we know a little bit about how alienated populations act politically. They're vulnerable to right-wing demagogues and all the rest of it. And the economists will look at a situation and say, where is this coming from? We have no measure that tells us that somebody will elect Donald Trump, or somebody will elect Bolsonaro, or somebody will elect Orban in Hungary. What's going on? The figures don't add up to tell us. And I'm kind of going there, but because you don't understand the concept of alienation. A state of alienation is widespread. I mean, people are alienated in their jobs, they're alienated in their daily lives, they're alienated by the conditions of urban life, the unsatisfactory conditions of, say, transportation in Mexico City or New York City or wherever. And there's a general arena of discontent and alienation. And just because you can't measure it doesn't mean it's not there. And in fact, most of the interesting things that happen in the world happen precisely because of the things that you can't see and don't know and are not there. I mean, for instance, when the Soviet Union collapsed, nobody thought that would happen. All the social scientists said that would never happen. And then all of a sudden it just went, phew. Well, what? How did that happen? So you have all these kinds of events of this sort which occur, including, we're living with this now in the United States, with the election of Donald Trump. I mean, an insane situation. How did it possibly occur? And how is it that people still vote for him? And in the last elections, even though he lost some, what was surprising to me was there was still a vast amount of support for him. Well, because he speaks the anger. And the sense of dislocation and all the rest of it. And yeah, he does all these things that presidents are not supposed to do. I mean, he calls people, you're a little shit, and all this kind of stuff. And a large segment of the population has wanted to say to their boss for a long time, you're just a fucking shit, get out of my way, And Trump gives release to all of that politically. but you got to understand some of that. So I'm not arguing that the money stuff is irrelevant. I think it's terribly relevant, the dynamics of the money stuff, and it has to be understood for what it is. But we also have to remember that its relationship between the immaterial aspect of value. These things are very interesting. For instance, the most recent example I've encountered is, there's this movement in the United States called Me Too. I get to China and I'm in this university, Nanjing, and there's a huge Me Too thing going on, And Me Too is kind of being echoed all around the place. So it's something that just happens there, and then somehow that resonates. Therefore, again, I think we have to be careful not to kind of imagine that somehow or other everything is isolated, and there is therefore this relationality, spatial relationality. I'll give you another example. On February the 15th of 2003, there was a global demonstration against the prospect of the United States going to war against Iraq. Nobody organized that globally, but you had 2 million people out on the street in Madrid, you had 2 million people in Barcelona, you had 3 million out in Rome, you had nearly 2 million in London. Where did that come from? Where? And again, it's a relationality. It's not as if anybody organized it. Yeah, okay, the net was alive, and and social media was alive with all kinds of things. But this was a moment when it was almost like there was a global expression of public opinion of a mass of people around the world. And again we see movements of this kind. I mean, okay, there's an Occupy movement, and suddenly there's an Occupy movement in London, and then everywhere you go there's an Occupy movement somewhere. There was the anti-globalization protests of 1999, began in Seattle, and the next thing there's Geneva, and then there's, so you can't explain these things by kind of simple material organizational. It's about, again, the social relations, the social meaning, the kind of what it is that animates people to suddenly decide they want to go to the streets. I kind of wonder always, and I think about all those people who are on the street in 2003, what would have happened if they stayed on the street? And they just said, no, we're not moving, we're not going to work, we're not going to do anything, because this is, so I think these questions. Now, one of the reasons I like some of the Marx's formulations is that he is very concerned with the objective consequences of these social relations, but he never kind of says, therefore the social relation is irrelevant because I'm now working with the objective consequences. And I think that you ask the question, what is the objective of a revolutionary movement? And a lot of people say, well, we want minimum wage, or we want this, or we want that, and they will give you all these kinds of things. And my answer is no, we want the social relations to change. And changing social relations means changes in mental conceptions of the world. It means changes in material practices. It means all of these changes. So revolutionary movement is about all of those things. And one of the reasons, I think, that the whole history of communism got so badly turned around was, I think, a failure to recognize. I mean, the Soviets gave up on the idea of changing social relations. The social relations were frozen. Yeah. I think protests can change things, yeah. But again, you have to be careful about this. For example, before Occupy Wall Street occurred, there was almost no discussion in the US press on social inequality. It was, the media was completely quiet about those issues. They were not being discussed politically, and they weren't being discussed in terms of economy or anything. They weren't being discussed. Occupy Wall Street came along and said, the 1%. The 1% is now entered into universal discourse, okay? Before Wall Street, nobody talked about the 1%. Now everybody knows what you mean by the 1%, and we can talk about the 10% or the 0.1%, but everybody is talking about the 1%, and everybody knows what you mean by the 1%. So Occupy Wall Street changed the conversation. Now, in Obama's re-election, he actually talked about the problem of social inequality. Nobody before politically dared to talk about that, but afterwards, yes, Obama could talk about it. And to some degree, Obama's re-election, I think, had something to do with the fact that Obama was seen as a representative of, doing something about social inequality, versus Mitt Romney, who was seen as being one of the 1%. So I'm not going to say that the election was determined by Occupy Wall Street, but Occupy Wall Street opened up a political space where something different could be discussed, something different could happen. And good protests do that. And then there are protests which just come and disappear. And then there are protests that have negative results because people kind of dismiss the protesters as being troublemakers or whatever. So I think without some level of protest, nothing's going to change. How it changes and how much it changes, but be careful as kind of saying, because it didn't have an immediate objective, and Occupy Wall Street did not have an immediate objective. They had no idea what it was they wanted. But again, one of the things that happened there was simply by raising the question of the 1%, they got Wall Street people so nervous that the Wall Street people called the mayor, who was a billionaire, and said, "Quash this protest." And then the vigor of the response to it kind of led a lot of people to say, hey, wait a minute, they're a fairly innocent bunch of people occupying a fairly small space in Manhattan. Why don't you leave them alone and let them go home on their own at some point? But no, we have to get the police out, and we have to hammer them, and then people kind of say, are we living in a police state? What's going on here? And that question is still hovering around, and that dynamic. For instance, both the Gezi Park and the Brazil protests were fairly small protests. It was the police response which generated the huge protest, and a recognition that actually we're supposed to live in a society which is neoliberal. The founding text of which comes from Milton Friedman, that says we are free to choose. And then along comes Margaret Thatcher and says there is no alternative, and you are not free to choose. And along comes, and so the legitimacy of the whole neoliberal project is slowly, step by step, being brought into question, because it's supposed to be about freedom of choice and entrepreneurial this and that and everything else. And it turns out it's really about monopoly control, and it's about authoritarian control. Capital is very sophisticated and very flexible. And one of the problems the left has to deal with is that there's no such thing as a good idea that capital cannot co-opt. Now, you can argue it's better that capital co-opt it than it not exist at all. And so it's good that there's something out there that's supposed to be a sharing economy, and that this is, maybe there's some good things about it. And social relations may be a bit different or whatever, So there's issues of that kind. But the left, I think, is from my perspective, is often very conservative. It's got a fixed kind of idea, and there's not the flexibility of mental conceptions on the left that really needs to be there. Now, people will criticize me, for example, for being what they would call pragmatic or opportunistic or something like that, and I kind of go, well, yeah, so what, you know? We have to move with wherever is moving. But I think it's very important also to have a clear idea of what the ultimate objective is. So if I kind of say, look, I'm into anti-capitalist politics, but I recognize that anti-capitalist politics can take many forms. There are forms of gender struggle which are anti-capitalist. There's a strong component of the environmental struggle which is anti-capitalist. There are cultural struggles which are anti-capitalist. So I'm interested in how all of those different anti-capitalist struggles might relate to each other. And they are, of course, very different in form and structure to the struggles which classically occur in the workplace, which is working class versus capital. One of the big arenas of struggle right now is what to do about the debt system and the credit system. And how do we struggle against that? And who is the enemy here? And how do we control the enemy? And how do we analyze how the credit structures work in such a way as to imprison people in you know, debt encumbrancy? You know, it's almost like a feudal system of debt peonage. How do we make that struggle, and how do we relate that struggle to the classical struggles that still exist in the workplace? And what is those classical struggles were really about? I mean, there's a lot of struggle going on in China right now amongst the labor force. I mean, huge struggles. I mean, it's you know, exactly the same as cement statistics, the kind of way the statistics on workplace struggles in China are just sort of way up there. And the big question is this what Marx called a class in itself that doesn't understand what its positionality is? Or is it in the process of conversion into a class for itself that starts to see itself as being a militant organization for some future? And of course the China case is complicated because the Communist Party has, 91 million members. I mean, this is a big party. It's very well organized. And it appeals to Marx. I mean, I was there for the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, you know, and you know, the night before Xi Jinping gives his big talk, and then we all give our talks, you know, and you know, the whole ideology is built around you know, Marx, Lenin, Mao, you know, Deng Xiaoping, now Xi, you know, I mean, and how do they take their sort of communist declaration which was there this year, that kind of said China will be a fully socialist society by the year 2050. And it then said there are a number of issues we need to address in the coming, you know, 20-odd years. Well, one of them is social inequality. They realize they've got a problem. Second is environment. They know they've got an environmental catastrophe on their hands. Third is what they call social harmony, which is really mitigating or preventing the outbreak of class struggle, but promoting harmony between different factions, which they're not doing a very good job of because they're oppressing working movement and they're oppressing the Muslim minorities. So, you know, but how do they fix that with all of this struggle going on? The workers themselves have not lost confidence in the party. And it's interesting that they're not so much, most of the struggles are not so much concerned with wages and work conditions, although there's a lot of that. The big demand is to be treated with respect. and decency. And I think actually working class movements historically have not necessarily been revolutionary in the sense that they wanted to overturn everything, and they've often been about, look, I just want to be treated with some decency and respect, and I don't mind going to work for somebody else, and I don't mind having my labor exploited to some degree, within reason, provided I'm treated as a human being. And again, this is a value thing. Yeah. This is an immaterial demand. It's not something that can be satisfied by raising the wages or passing a law. In fact, the Chinese government passed an anti-neoliberal labor law in 2007, 2008. But then this question of respect and dignity and the like comes in, and again, these are the intangibles which I think actually can motivate whole populations into mass movements. Well, I'm very pessimistic. I mean, I just wrote a little piece about Jacobin magazine about housing. And I came across a sort of a little booklet put out by the Municipal Association of New York back in 1972, which said, "Housing in the public domain, the only solution." And the point that was being made there was that market solutions to affordable housing were bound to fail, and that the only solution was to take all affordable housing out of the market, put it in the public domain, and to invest in it as a public good on behalf of the population. Well, that was clearly the situation that was understood in '72. And at that point, a lot of money was being given to pursue that objective. And so you start to find some social housing being built everywhere. By 1980 and Ronald Reagan, it's all gone. No money for any of that. We're not interested in any of that. It all has to go into the market and so on. The result is we have 60,000 homeless people in New York City. About half of the population does not have adequate access to housing in New York City at a time when the building boom in the city is bigger than it's ever been, and it's all building apartments for the top 1%. And you look at this and you kind of go, this is insane. And it's purely to do with the fact that people treat housing as simply a vehicle for accumulation of capital. Individuals become concerned with the exchange value of their housing rather than the use value. Use values kind of disappear from the equation. And you take over perfectly beautiful use values and you convert them via the exchange value into something else. So that some of the actually very, very fine public housing that was built in Britain, say, back in the 1960s and 1970s, is basically taken over by the bourgeoisie. And what used to be depicted as public housing and therefore a place that gives rise to social pathologies is now actually occupied by Wall Street bankers whose social pathology is far, far worse than the kind of social pathology that the people used to complain about. So this is the kind of world, yeah. So I think that of course, some of the big architects have enjoyed the ride into neoliberalism, Rem Koolhaas included, who went from being, a guy who was really concerned about urbanism and urban qualities of life to just being a site architect and, forgetting all of that kind of stuff. and I don't forgive the architects their betrayal of what seems to me to be a basic function of what architecture should be about, which is about producing a beautiful environment urban environment for mass of the population. There's still some good stuff done. I mean, I was very impressed with the quality of social housing in Uruguay, for example. Uruguay, I was very impressed with what they had done, and of course it's a strange little country. Nobody goes to Uruguay very much. And they have strange presidents like this guy Mujica, who is kind of really kind of wild lefty with some very strange concepts. But so there is, and this is where local governments, and I hope here in Mexico City, but we might see some of this, can start to kind of sort of take back some of the housing into the public domain, and in doing so, come up with means of production and architectural forms which are more meeting the needs of the mass of the population, and we badly need that in New York too.